Welcome to episode 7 of the H.E.A.R.T podcast, everyone. In today's episode, we focus on intergroup dialogue and anti-racist teaching. Specifically, our guests will be guiding us through the process of how they help facilitate conversations between members of various social identity groups in an effort to create new levels of understanding, relating, and ultimately loving one another. Join us as we delve deeper into these themes and hear how our guests integrate their knowledge in the classroom. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, and Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations.
Thank you, Omar. Joining us today is Danielle DeRosa, who is a clinical instructor in the sport management program at the University of Connecticut. In her role, Danielle oversees the instruction of the experiential learning of undergraduate students in sport management. She also co-teaches with me the only graduate-level intergroup dialogue course at UConn. Also joining us is Dr. Rani Varghese, who is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at Adelphi University. With a background in social work, social justice education, and women, gender, and sexuality studies, Rani brings an interdisciplinary and intersectionality approach to her teaching and research. She also teaches intergroup dialogue at Adelphi University. With us also today is Dr. Wilson Okello, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. His research focuses on Black feminisms in education, anti-Blackness in educational contexts, and anti-deficit curriculum and pedagogy, which we will hear more about throughout the episode. All right, everyone, we hope you are as excited to learn from them as we are. Let's get started. Danielle, Rani, and Wilson, thank you again for being here with us today. All of you are involved with research or teaching or both related to intergroup dialogue, which is often referred to as IGD. From your perspective, what is IGD and what does it entail in terms of your teaching? Wondering also if you could speak to how anti-racist teaching shows up in your IGD teaching. Danielle, would you be willing to get us started on the conversation today?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me. So I teach intergroup dialogue, as you had just said, and a spoiler alert for those on the call, Milagros and I actually co-teach an intergroup dialogue course, so I'll refer to that, I'm sure, throughout this episode. But in our course, we center race as a social identity. So really, it's the opportunity for students to dialogue across racial identity. And we do that throughout an entire semester, leading them through 4 phases in which they get to know each other. They have the opportunity to learn a bit more about historical context. We get to dialogue around contentious issues, and then we have the opportunity to think about what the path forward is for the students in terms of alliance building or being an accomplice to each other. And really, we've started to see it as a shared responsibility that we have to each other, and the students helped us to understand it as that. When I think about anti-racist teaching and the connection between intergroup dialogue and anti-racist teaching, I think that there's a lot of underlying fundamental values that I bring to the classroom as someone who's facilitating dialogue, and also think about when I'm thinking about anti-racist teaching. So some of those things would be kind of this essence of love and humility and humankind. 2 years ago, we had the opportunity to bring in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he really helps us to think about this idea of profound love and kind of faith in each other and in humankind, and how that can drive us in dialogue to be hopeful. And we've really been thinking about that over the past years. And the reason that I'm connecting it to anti-racist teaching, Milagros, you helped us to understand or to think a few minutes ago about how sometimes anti-racist teaching or anti-racist work could be looked at kind of being in opposition to and pushing against something. And I absolutely think that, and I think that's part of the way that I orient myself to anti-racist teaching. But I also think that love is part of that too. So rather than fighting against, kind of the opening of someone's heart and just really being and acknowledging humility and humanity and what happens when we're able to do that. And that's extremely vulnerable, and I think takes a lot of trust, but I think can be really transformative if, one, myself as an educator can commit to that, and I can also cultivate along with whoever I'm facilitating with, a classroom space that enables that for our students too.
Yeah, that's really powerful because love is something that from my perspective is central to anti-racist work. But often a taboo word or maybe even idea when it comes about thinking about the academy and what learning really means. So I'm curious, Rani, would you be able to chime in and share what are your thoughts about IGD and how it connects to anti-racist teaching, and maybe even your thoughts on this idea of love being central to that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if it's helpful to, I don't know, Milagros, in other podcasts, have we explained what IGD is in terms of like, so, so I think it's always important to name what intergroup dialogue is. So it's an evidence-based model that first came out of the University of Michigan that brings people together of either different identity groups, so intergroup dialogue, or similar identities, intergroup dialogue, to have conversations that folks may not have or have the opportunity to have around social justice issues using a particular curriculum. Many there are intergroup dialogue programs across the country, intergroup dialogue courses across the country and across the globe. And it, as Danielle said, it's a four-part model or stages. First is like understanding yourself, building a container for dialogue of building a community. Second, understand yourself in terms of your identities. The third is to dialogue about hot topics. And the fourth is to take action. And so for me, part of building that intentional community or building that community with love is really looking at the building blocks of dialogue, which is around deep listening. So one of the pieces of research I was involved in looking at intergroup dialogue was originally part of that nine college study looking at the impact of dialogue. And a lot of times when we think about dialogue, we really focus on voicing, but our work was really looking at the power of deep listening. And so I think, again, if we think about what love embodies, I think it's deep listening, having respect, holding judgments or biases, being reflective, and engaging in inquiry, and learning how to use your voice in thoughtful and productive ways. And so for me, the building blocks of dialogue really embody what sort of we're saying is love. And I think part of what is powerful for me about intergroup dialogue is the use of self. And again, use of self is a term that I use in social work, particularly clinical social work. But for me, many diversity and equity courses center content. And I think process is part of it in terms of processing the content. But I think with IGD, they center both the process and the content so that you're intentional, like you engage the content through process. You're intentional about how you set up the course. It forces you to slow down the process in ways that are very different than other courses. Sometimes I didn't coin this, but a student in one of my classes once used the word like social justice cruise control. And I was thinking about like when you're driving and you just the car is going. And so for me with IGD, it forces me to sit up and engage in a very different way. So I'll stop there. I mean, I could talk more about like race and IGD, but I'll hand it off to someone else.
Powerful offerings, and so thank you, Rani, for that. The reflection and really this merging of process and content, and really walking us through the steps. Danielle, I was struck just by your this infusion of love, and so I wasn't preparing to go here at this particular point, but I'm glad that you took us there, because I agree with you. I think that love is oftentimes read as not only taboo, but oftentimes we view it as sort of this romantic, or so we only think about it in sort of the romantic sphere, if you will, right? And so what does it mean to really sort of take up love as a critical practice, right? So how might we begin to love, and in my work, I'm trying to think about what it means to intentionally love Blackness in particular, right? And so what does it look like to affirm a bodily presence, a spiritual presence, a mental, emotional, spiritual, spatial sort of being in this world that is mediated by history in full and affective ways, right? And so I'm thinking about Baby Suggs in Beloved. Toni Morrison takes us here, and she talks about this space in the clearing in particular, and she writes that Baby Suggs was inviting us into sort of this collective love response. And I almost see that as a form of dialogue, right? The call and response that was enacted in that particular moment is inviting a communal love practice. She's saying, love your flesh, love it hard, right? She's inviting us to say that in a world where you're going to move beyond this place where they don't love you, we have to think about what it means for us to intentionally, to not only sort of care for ourselves, but to love ourselves in some really powerful ways. And so I think about IGD at its best as a communal practice of seeing, right, of feeling and of doing on behalf of one another, right? It's the belief that individuals hold the capacity to make decisions about their lives and their communities, right? Because oftentimes, as educators who are equipped with particular knowledge and training, we believe, even if we say we don't sometimes, right, that we have the answer, or we can steer individuals in directions that allow them, move them towards solutions about their communities and about their lives, right? IGD, I think at its best, right, allows for individuals to take ownership, right, or returns power to individuals to make decisions about what their lives can be, what they ought to be. It's a belief that they have and have been doing the work to negotiate the problems that are present in their lives. And so I'm thinking about, again, IGD at its best as a space of representation. I'm thinking about it as a space of embodiment, of bringing the body to bear in the classroom. And I'll probably talk about this a little bit more as I go throughout, but it really sort of hones in on my commitments to Black feminist practice. And so I'll pause there and just kind of invite others into the conversation. But that's sort of where I was going, or what I'm thinking about when I hear this notion of love and IGD at its best.
I have something to build off that. So part of the question I realized after you asked the Milagros was this idea of what does entail in terms of teaching. And I think we all touched on it a bit, but actually, Wilson, when you were just talking about this idea of a communal practice and seeing, feeling, doing, disrupting this idea that, teacher has the answer and everyone is there to learn the answer from the teacher. Rani, you mentioned this as well. One thing that we've done in our class through the years is this notion of unclassing the class, because I think all of these things that we all just mentioned as part of our practice are really counterintuitive to the ways in which many of us are taught to see education, or our place as educators and our students' place students. So for us in our classroom, that looks like a lot of things. But when I was thinking about unclassing the class, for some reason, I just thought about, I have 2 kids. And when my son was in kindergarten, I would try to go into his classroom every so often. And I remember at first it just being this place that was awesome. Like, I instantly loved it. And I think as I reflect back, the thing that I loved the most about it was that it was playful, it was fun, it was unexpected. It was kind of like all the things that I felt like I had lost through my time in education. But then in there, just being there with the kids was amazing. And then thinking about our classroom that we've created, it's like, what happens in the educational process and that we lose these characteristics, and then how do we recapture them back? So some of the things that we have done is invite food into the classroom. Like, we have one class where we literally set it up to look like a kitchen. We put tablecloths on the tables, we have flowers, we have food, and we just use that as a communal space to connect with each other. So I don't know if anyone else has experiences, or if that unclassing the class is something that you all have done. But
yeah, I mean, I think for me, IGD, I described it as sort of like this model, right? This model that, you have the curriculum, but I think IGD as a principle or practice is something I use in all my classes. Like I do teach an intergroup dialogue course where I introduce undergrad students to IGD, give them an opportunity to participate in the IGD dialogue around a range of isms. And then I give them a chance to co-facilitate. And I move out of the classroom and allow them to facilitate a conversation with their peers around the things that, which I think, Wilson, you mentioned about things that are important, that matter to them and their community across a range of identities. And because most co-teaching models, at least in my institution, are not compensated, right? Like IGD is usually co-taught. I draw on friends and family in the community. So talking about love, folks come to my class because they love IGD, they love me, they love working with students and co-facilitate these range of hot topics. And so I think that is really important. And yes, I think I say to students, at first I was like, this seems like, should I say this? I said, IGD will change your life. And I have found, I was like, okay, I'm going to lean into it. It has changed. It changed my life. It changed, I think it's changed the students' life, because not only are they using these skills of dialoguing in the classroom, they're using it with their partners, with their families. And I think some of that work is critical. It's, again, like oppression can gut you in this way, and it allows them to feel hopeful and look at it from, again, like not but racial justice, framing it from a place of liberation. And so, and again, I use it in faculty meetings, right? Like I try to embody this, and it's hard work. And I think you named it earlier. I wrote down heart and head connection, and folks, I think one of the other podcast members talked about like heart work as it's hard work, and I really see that. So yes, and I bring in food to all my classes, although this semester it's been, this year has been really hard of how do you think of IGD, this interpersonal face-to-face practice, and do it on Zoom. So, I've been creative. I'm, bringing in music. I'm trying to recreate, transform this online space in ways that are meaningful and allows connection, because they're so disconnected in this online world right now.
I really appreciate those points. And Danielle, I'm thinking about what you put forth as this idea of unclassing the classroom. I think is really important. So I'm thinking about it in conversation with this notion of unschooling that sort of takes place. And what I hear in that is this notion of inviting a sort of self-directed type of learning, right? So how might we not only think about what it means to be facilitators, but invite individuals to chart the direction of their learning, right? And so, yeah, so I appreciate that notion, right? And I think there's the belief that individuals, again, have the capacity to make decisions about their own lives and what matters to their community. So there was another thought I had as it was, it was thinking about this notion Rani was mentioning about IGD and its liberatory potential. And so I think IGD, and so I've mentioned this in my first sort of comments, but I think it, at its best, has the potential to do these things. But I've been trying to meditate on what white institutions do to liberatory pedagogies, right, and critical theories. And I think if we're not careful, I wonder how IGD can get swept up in sort of the mechanics, the sort of dispassionate, the polite white supremacy that some exchange or some discourse favors in white institutions. And so I say IGD at its best, I think is rooted in diverse cultural practices, right? I think it was and existed long before we sort of thought about what it might look like within the institution. And so how might we return to that in and through cultural modes, right? And so whether food is one of them. You talked about music, Ronnie. I think about art, right? I think about the body and dance. I think about um, other opportunities to engage in sort of these dynamic cultural practice, hip hop, for example, free individuals up to express and be and write, to poet, to do all the things, or to locate knowledge in a different place than in this sort of traditional linguistic sort of verbal exchange that I think IGD can sometimes favor.
Mhm.
And so wanted to offer that as well.
That's just okay. You all are just having me go to all these happy places in my head and I can't even keep up with my own excitement as I'm listening to you all because I'm just like, oh yeah, that, oh, and that too, yes. And but I want to connect to two things that I just heard, Wilson, with you mentioning the multimodal learning that's possible when IGD is at its best, you know, like it really does allow for there to be the unschooling, the unclassing the class, like, you know, I think that that's really powerful because it's a disruption. So what you were saying is what happens to IGD when it gets kind of co-opted, but when it's at its best is actually the opposite of whatever is traditional teaching and learning. So you know when it's been co-opted, when it goes too smooth into the into the scenario. And I think even with students though, because students can even have some kind of like, wait, what's happening here? I thought I was in a graduate course for a master's program or whatever it might be. That disruption is in the experience for everybody. And if it's not shaking up how we're learning and what we're learning, then it isn't actually intergroup dialogue in its full form. But I also want to go back to something, Danielle, you said earlier about unclassing the class. And, you know, even those different approaches, whether it's turning the classroom into a kitchen or going out on a field trip and doing classrooms in different spaces, you know, like outside of a real classroom, just making different spaces a learning space, whatever that might be. Something that it strikes, or at least I'm hearing, is that students can learn in their full humanity and that might spark joy in learning. That I think, Rani, you were saying, like, there's a way in which oppression and I think colonial and white supremacist learning guts, particularly for Black and Indigenous and other racially minoritized students, guts the soul out of them along the way. And IGD is, in a way, I never thought about this. So I would like you all to check me if I'm like, you're taking it in the wrong direction, but I'm hearing you all and it's making me think, is it like a restorative practice? Because are we restoring? And I don't mean restorative practice like the framework. I'm saying, is it restoring what's possible when you teach with full humanity at the center of a teaching? I don't know. Those are some thoughts that came to my mind, and curious what you all think.
You're making me think. So we do a final project called, and Ronnie had mentioned, you know, the framework before. So as part of the IGD framework, there's a final project called the ICP, the Intergroup Collaboratory Project. And that looks different for every class and the way that the instructors decide to teach it. But for us, what it has looked like over the years, I guess what's fundamental is that you're bringing students, so in our case, because we teach about race, across racial identity together to work on a project together. And for our class, it's been a gallery walk. And they have to create something visual that's tied to art. So Milagros, you just made me think about this idea of, you know, restoring some of this process for students. And this project sticks out for me because it's always a struggle for some students. And we get a lot of pushback and thinking about how are we going to express ourselves in this ways? There's questions about the syllabus, about the rubrics and how we're going to grade it. But then there's always a small group of students who just flourish in this project, and they are so creative, and it's so fun to watch them. And I think it's this moment where I'm wondering, you know, it kind of makes all of the tedious, detailed questions about the rubric and when it's due and how will it be submitted totally fine, because I get to see this subset of students who are just loving this process. And I can't imagine that they're asked to express their learning in this way really often. And it's really powerful.
So that's a really powerful point and example. I'm thinking about so many of the classes I've taught over time, and the number of I'll say Black students, but I think broadly Black, Indigenous, people of color who will line the front of my classroom in some of the introductory classes, for example, and I think it's partially because of this sort of ways they've been taught or trained to, if I'm not seen in this sort of white space, how do I ensure that the faculty member or professor sees me, right? And so when we think about what it means to center, to not only decenter whiteness, but for me, again, center something else, center Blackness, it means sort of working from an inverted space that says, I'm not working up to the idea that something like racism or anti-Blackness exists, but that's the beginning place, right? That's the fundamental starting place we begin, and everyone else has an opportunity to then, or I should say, it centers the experiences of folks who might be at the front of the classroom, but oftentimes, or for most of their schooling, have not have had to sort of participate in learning environments where I think whiteness was centered in a way that said, let's be patient with our those who don't have a firm understanding or who don't have a lived experience, and let's be patient with them and allow them to sort of have free reign in the classroom. And so I mentioned that to Danielle's point to say that I think something happens when we center a different cultural practice in the classroom that allows individuals to move, to feel, to express themselves differently. And I wonder what it looks like as a I wonder what that could look like as just a general way of being, right? So how do we invite individuals to rehearse a different way of being in the classroom? And I think as we center differently because of some of the practices within IGD, I think we invite individuals into a different type of freedom moving forward, right? Because they've been trained throughout their educational experience to say, this is how the classroom is going to go. But when you invite them into a different way of being, I think it allows them to begin to imagine different possibilities of being. And so I agree with you, and that the practice that you're talking about sounds really important.
I mean, I think for me, I was going back to the unclassic class. I think because my doctoral training is in social justice education, I felt like my doctoral training was all about unclassing the class. And IGD was one vehicle or approach to doing this, right? And I think for me, the ways in which we shift power or shift experiences for, I'll just use myself because use of self is important. So, as a South Asian woman who, embodies this brown body, and as somebody who grew up in Ohio, in Cincinnati, the nasty natty, as we call it, to give it a little flavor, I learned about anti-Black racism as I was learning about anti-Asian racism, being in a Black and white community at the University of Cincinnati and in this R.A.P program. But it was also important to me in my social justice training to really understand the ways in which I had privilege. And so for me, when I co-teach IGD with my students, I bring in my former students who took class with me or current students, and I talk about my privilege around disability, and they get centered in a different way. So I think it's important to think about, or someone who is a person of color who has privilege around sexuality. So I think for me, I think part of this conversation is about like anti-racism and intersectionality. And so, or racial justice and intersectionality. And I think for me, I've been trained in social justice ed, like my homes are social justice ed and women, gender, sexualities. Like I've been deeply influenced by Black feminists. So I can't teach in any other way but through this intersectional lens, right? I think about like Elsa Barkley Brown, who talk about women not having the same gender because the context of being women is really rooted in race, place, and time. And so for me, IGD also gives you an opportunity for students to position themselves and think about how they hold multiple identities. So my experiences of being a South Asian woman is rooted in my gender and my class and my sexuality and my ability and my nationality and my language. And so I can't disentangle those. I don't know how to do it. And I think it's important to hold up and unpack, go in and deep, but to hold these different identities and the interlocking system at the same time.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about your question, Milagros, and so in terms of what is restored, and so I think about it as a political activity, right? And so how might we envision the classroom and our pedagogies, to Rani's point, as a political activity, and when we do that, I think there's always something at stake when in what we do and what we teach, or what we decide not to teach and or not do in the classroom. And so, so I appreciate the notion that we're complicating identity. And for me, and given my sort of commitments as well, I think about it, just very much as a political activity that we're engaged in. And I don't know and I maybe I troubled the notion of restore since we've been in the pandemic and folks talk about getting back to this notion of a norm. But for me, I'm trying to think about what does it mean to imagine a new world altogether. And I think those are the sorts of things that I think our students are yearning for. It's not just sort of a return to, or restoration of, but an imagining of what could be or is yet to be. So.
I love that, because you're right. Like, a restore assumes a place that was good before or nourishing before. When I think of restore, I think about a lot of my scholarship focuses on an asset-based view on what students already know, given their own racial, cultural identities and the communities that they come from. We often think that and I don't mean, when I say we, I'm saying in higher education, there's like this perspective that they come into your classroom and you just dump all this new knowledge in there. But, so when I think I'm restoring, it's kind of like, what do we need to get out of the way so that you could be who you were always capable of being, but that we probably messed up and destroyed or somehow limited or thwarted with all these other restrictions about what was possible. So I like that combination about looking also forward to even things we haven't even imagined as possible yet, or even as something that we could collectively create together, which is really powerful too, to think about the collective imagination about what's possible. I'm curious to hear, Wilson and Danielle, if intersectionality is something you also feel like somehow how does that inform your teaching, if at all? I'm curious, given, what Rani was saying about, like, there's no other way that she can teach. And I really appreciate, Rani, that, the way you entered that into the conversation, and how much of it is just like your path, like your work, your commitment, your training, but also who you are. I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, I would say for myself, thinking about, I identify as a white woman. So thinking about the way in which race and gender, and then identities such as sexuality, being able-bodied, my socioeconomic status, how all of those things come together to create who I am, how I experience the world, and how the world experiences me. And thinking about that, in life form. And then also, I think when I was thinking about this question prior to the podcast, I was also thinking about, in our intergroup dialogue class, we do engage in intra-group dialogue. So we will have students engage in smaller group dialogues based on their racial identity. And that's complicated in and of itself. And the ways in which we do it is that students who identify as white, the students self-identify for the purpose of when we engage in intra-group, will engage in dialogues with me, and the students who identify as students of colors with Milagros. We have a teaching assistant named Truth this year. And this year we did it where there was even separate readings for those students to think about their racial identity a bit more. So when I'm thinking about intersectionality, I'm both acknowledging that kind of like the culmination of who we are as people informs what we do, informs how we interact with the world, like I said before. But also, there is this interest I have noticed, including myself, among people who identify as white to want to talk about other identities outside of race. So it's kind of holding in tension with how do we allow for this, you know, whole person to be in the space, and also for me as a white woman facilitating when I'm in intergroup dialogue with white students, how do I allow for people to bring the nuanced complexity of who they are, but also hold them accountable for talking about race in a really straightforward way? Because I think that that is disruptive and needs to be done, right? As we're naming white supremacy, and like, so we need to name whiteness, and we have to own whiteness and the ways that it shows up. And I do that for myself. I encourage my students to do that. So I'm just thinking about that as we also talk about intersectionality, because it's a fine balance, I think.
I mean, for me, I was going to say, for me, intersectionality is the relational nature of difference and similarity. So I would say, Danielle, you live the life you live because because intersectionality is not just embodied in our body. It's the relational nature of difference and similarity. And so for me, it's not like you throw race out, but like, a South Asian woman, and again, I don't know how you all identify. You named being a white woman. Wilson, I don't know how you identify your, race and gender, but to me, this is the conversation. Like, it's not just, it's because IGD is relational. It's about the intragroup experience. As folks of color, my South Asianness and how South Asians live next to in relationship to Blackness. I can't not talk about Blackness when I talk about Asianness or South Asianness. So I think to me it's hard not to do it.
Agreed. So thinking about this notion of so to your question, Milagros, I think about power as I think about intersectionality. And I think about, to Ryan's point, how do we exist in relationship to others and the world around us? And so if we are particularly, it shows up in the sorts of questions and that I ask, right? And so trying to sort of complicate the sort of single issue, as Audre might say, or the simplified sort of overlay of an issue, and trying to sort of think about what intersectionality calls us to think about, which is sort of this compounding nature of oppressions, and how that affects individuals differently, right? And so, for example, I begin each class period with a what's going on, like what's in the news, right? And so we think about an issue or a headline, but we think about that sort of issue in relationship to individuals who might encounter those things and how they might encounter it differently. So me as a Black cishet man, I will certainly perhaps experience this differently than a Black woman, right? And how does our sort of ways of being historically come to bear on how I'm seen and interpreted, right? How are the ways in which society views and what's projected onto Black women impact how they're going to be sort of seen and read, right? And so these are things that I hope to complicate, even if we're not naming intersectionality explicitly, but hoping to really draw out the compounding nature of oppressions and how individual lives are affected differently. And so for me, this is part definition work as well, because I think intersectionality is probably one of those ideas that is oftentimes underdefined and oftentimes misappropriated, and just so to the point that the originators, or those who sort of wrote initially about it, to the point that it's almost unrecognizable, right? We talk about it as multiple identities, for example, and we sort of just leave it there. And so that's why I sort of want to harken back to this notion of power and the compounding nature of it, because if we're not clear, right, about what this is, what the term, right, and really what the more than even the term, but what the force and the thrust of the idea is calling on us to do, then I think we minimize its potential effect in our class. So.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, Milagros, you said IGD being co-opted, intersectionality has been co-opted. I think Jennifer Nash's book, Black Feminism Reimagined, really gets at that. I mean, I've heard her speak. I mean, she's really getting at, taking the origin and whether it's it's a concept, theory, methodology, however we want to frame it, but that's been co-opted and it's been packaged in this way that's in some ways unrecognizable.
Right. I know for sure. And I think that's why I was really excited about this conversation, because IGD, even if you don't, those four kind of, stages of IGD, even if you don't use the word intersectionality, gets at it because it is exposure to thinking about systems and structures, and then thinking about that in connection to self, and then thinking about that in connection to others. And it's like this, it is like there's this intertwining between the self, others, and systems and how they're operating. And I feel like that, to me, is the conversation that can maybe make learning around intersectionality possible, because it is an infusion of systems and structures with self and community. And that infusion is built into the phases, into the structure rather of IGD. So I feel like it's a potentially, like, I like what Wilson's saying, at its best. Mm-hmm. IGD is a really powerful way to maybe make that learning palpable, in the classroom. So
first of all, thank you all so much for sharing such a multidimensional perspective of IGD. Be honest, wasn't not too familiar with it prior to this episode, so thank you all for enlightening me. And Wilson, you mentioned something that really struck me as we're slowly, knock on wood, looking to return to spaces now, physical spaces, now that COVID-19 is at least in the United States, it's calming. And you mentioned, Wilson, how can we reimagine a new world altogether, coming back to a new world, not a world that we once knew, which was not great to begin with, yet there are these notions and rhetoric that it once was. And I definitely don't think you're alone on that one. And I'm just wondering, how I'm beginning to visualize how IGD can be used as a conduit, as a very healthy and loving conduit to dismantle systems of oppression. And I'm wondering, for our audience that are in different spaces, whether we're talking about scholars, whether we're talking about activists, students, and just human beings in general, I'm curious to know, what's one piece of advice that each of you could offer to our audience on enacting anti-racist teaching with a focus on intersectionality, and perhaps in consideration of teaching IGD?
I was going to say deep listening. I feel like the listening is, again, I think deep listening, listening with Ting, right? Listening with your eyes, your head, your heart, your ears, like that kind of deep listening, perspective taking. For me, in terms of thinking about faculty, like honoring my disciplinary training, but utilizing other disciplines to help you think about your teaching for social justice, and particularly racial justice. And also, part of the issue with, I think, academia, or the challenges, is most faculty I meet have been trained in their disciplines. They haven't been trained how to teach in their discipline. So they haven't even been trained how to teach. So, getting them to make what's invisible visible. What theories, what values, what scholars undergird your teaching? Like what is driving how you show up in the classroom, how you set up the classroom, who you call on, how you shape your assignments. And so I think for me, that's a start, just getting them to interrogate how and what they teach. And then teaching them some skills around IGD, just around deep listening, locate positionality. Speaking of political, when I ask faculty in DEI trainings to locate themselves, it's like blows their mind. They haven't even thought about who they are as folks who are located in systems, or systems of identity. And so those are some of those places. And do it in community. Like I'm like, when I come and meet folks, I'm like, let's write together. Let's come together and, add to this community dialogue. So those are the things that came to mind.
So Omar, as I'm thinking about your question about how do we begin to imagine differently, I think it begins by first asking ourselves the type of question: what type of world do we want, right? And as I think we ask that question, we can begin to sort of see how our practices, our pedagogies, our general ways of being, I think, create these own sort of regimes, right, or organized sort of ways that and expectations around what we believe should happen in the classroom, right? And so they lean into objectivity, they lean into the neutrality, they lean into some of these perhaps destructive forces that really don't invite this sort of freedom dreaming, as Robin Kelly might say, that I think is possible when we participate in an IGD sort of practice. And so, what is the sound, look, and feel of this sort of new world, right? And how might we invite individuals to consider what that they are knowers and have the capacity to do this type of dreaming. So I'm also wondering, I think in order for folks to begin to live that out, they need to have places where they can practice it and to rehearse it, right? And so I think about the classroom as a site of rehearsal more than anything. Is we can't expect this sort of dialogic practice outside in our meeting spaces, in corporate spaces or anywhere else, if we haven't sort of invited individuals to literally rehearse what it looks and feels like to participate in this sort of work in the classroom. And so think about invite individuals to consider what type of world they want and begin to rehearse those very things as the political project of the classroom.
Yeah, I love those ideas that you both shared. One thing I was thinking about is, so Rani, you had mentioned community, and I was thinking about relationships, and I don't think that it's far off from perhaps what you mentioned when you were talking about community. Maybe it's a bit different, but just finding people to invest in this work with and to invest in relationships with. And I also love this idea of the classroom as a rehearsal, but it's making me think about, Omar, when you first asked a question about going back, or, I forget how you initially framed it, but the thing that I immediately thought about was time, because I think, and slowing time down, because I think that there's this desire to kind of like jump back into things sometimes without the acknowledgement that that thing that we're jumping back into perhaps wasn't great, or maybe if it was great for us, it wasn't great for everyone. So slowing down kind of like the systems that force us to move at this pace that isn't sustainable for ourselves, that isn't sustainable for others, and to really slow that down to see then what is possible. I remember when the pandemic first hit, we would go for hikes, I think almost every day. It got us out of the house. Like I said before, I have 2 little kids, and I remember saying to my son, Max, that if you kind of stand still in nature, there's always something moving all around you. You just have to be slow enough to see it. So just thinking about what happens when we slow down, what do we see? And I'm thinking about, Milagros, even you and I, when we're teaching the class together, the amount of time that we pour into each other and that we pour into relationships with our students. And if we're not resisting the pace of the university or the pace of the system, then none of that is possible.
That is so beautiful. Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives, and that's such a beautiful way to end. Wow, I want to be mindful of everybody's time, so I'm sad that we have to end right now. However, I would like to thank all of you, Danielle, Rani, Wilson. Thank you so much for joining us today and for unpacking what intergroup dialogue is and how it aligns with anti-racist teaching. We really appreciate the complexity you've brought to the conversation, moving from embodied knowledge, emotions such as love, joy, as well as the complicated nature of intersectionality and how it can be a lens for anti-racist teaching. You've all shared such powerful ideas for us to think about to advance our learning.
And we're just so grateful for your work, for your teaching, for your willingness to share what you know with others. And so just thank you, and keep fighting the good fight.
We would like to thank our guests, Danielle DeRosa, Rani Varghese, and Wilson Okello, for bestowing us with their rich perspective and for conveying their continued commitment toward not only sharing love and joy in the classroom, but also teaching and passing it on to their students.
As always, we're thankful for the support from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at the University of Connecticut, because it takes a village and it takes hearts.